It's the Awake Space Astrology Podcast. I'm Laurie Rivers, your host, here to help you with some inspiration to get those aspirations out into the world. Well, here we are. This is the week where I believe we will have a global collective gasp because things are starting to heat up. And I don't just mean climate. I think we're going to see some pretty big booms when it comes to politics, areas of conflict. Basically, it's going to look like World War III is starting, but it's not going to. I want you to hold on to that. There's not going to be the hugeness that we feel like we're on the cusp of just yet anyway. But it is a pivotal moment in time. And I've been alluding to that, and I talked about that in the event I did with Medium Matilda, What in the World, which you can find in my Patreon shop. We weren't going to sell the recordings, okay? We kind of had committed to that, but we got enough requests of people asking that we've individually uploaded them into our shops. It's the same price as it was to come to the event. Event 1 deals more with what's happening in North and South America, a little bit of what's going on in Europe, climate, weather, natural disasters, political events. And then we focused a lot more on Europe and Asia in the second event, and that's because we were serving that audience. It's a wild week, guys. So, yes, we've just had that large geomagnetic storm. I'm not hugely surprised by it, and it kind of knocked me on my ass. I was not feeling good this weekend. Had a decent, rest, and it might have been my body just needed me to rest. But it was a pretty wild one. So I hope everything was okay where you're at. This week is intense, and I know I say that a lot. So let's take a deep breath together. Grab your coffee, grab your tea, grab your matcha, grab your hot cocoa, grab your bottle of water, whatever you're doing today to stay hydrated or have your thirst quenched. And whether we're driving to work together, running on the treadmill, folding the laundry, putting away the dishes, taking the kids to school, whatever we're doing, I hope I can help at least put your mind at ease. So, in this episode, I'm going to be giving you a heads up on what I expect to see in the headlines. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the energy of May. I'm going to read through one of the Energy of May pages in part from the magazine. And I had a request from Christy, one of my patrons. Hey, Christy, shout out to you. That I read articles for patron only, make some like listen material for patrons. And I thought, you know what? That's a great thing to do for patrons, $15 and up. I can do that. So that's not like patron only podcasts, but that will be me reading articles and maybe making a file. So I'm going to work on that. Because that sounds like a fun project, because I do read things on live streams, etc. But she's like, hey, if we could just have that for us. And I was like, oh, I can do a fancy recording for you guys. So I think I'm going to be doing that for patrons. I love suggestions, guys. I may not fulfill them all. I might have reasons for not doing certain things, but if patrons have ideas, I love to hear them. Of course, we'll do our patron shoutouts where I welcome our newest paid members. And I might do a little patron Q&A. I don't know. I got to check how many patrons asked questions this week. I don't know if you guys saw the moon phase video where I walked you through the 8 moon phases and how to use those energetically and for magical purposes. It has a little quiz. So I see that a few of you have taken it. We've got a few more questions. I could use more questions from patrons. There's a couple of you who are great at asking questions, and then once in a while, so I get a few more, but I could use more questions from patrons on the Googly form. I'll try to remember to get that in to the Patreon. So yeah, I'll probably answer maybe 2 or 3, and then we'll get the patron Q&A podcast out. I'm going to talk about yods on the patron only podcast. I'll talk about eclipses on the patron only podcast. I like to do the juicy ones for patrons. Let's see. Oh, I answered that one. I answered the question about crystals on the patron only Q&A. Alrighty. So this week is it's intense, guys. We're gonna have Mars moving towards the north node of the moon all week, culminating on the 18th. Which means it's historic events. I know, me too. I'm honestly as annoyed by them as you are. If you are in a major city center, please hear me again. If you're in a major city center, and that means a capital city or an economic capital city, so Los Angeles, New York, Washington, D.C., Houston, Austin, state capitals, as well. That could be something like, or economic capitals, London, Berlin, Paris, Melbourne, Sydney, Wellington, major cities. Okay. Think of major cities, Mumbai, major cities, most likely in Europe or North America. We could see some big events. Now, this could be weather, but it could be political. It could be a terrorist attack. We could see things like that this week. Not gonna lie, not my favorite theme either, but it could also be in the States, it could be a mass shooting. So, why that's not considered a terrorist attack, I don't know. But, I don't make the rules. I just report the astrology. So, I have it set on weeks. I'm looking at my chart software here. So, let's see. I'm going to set it to days, not weeks. So, starting with Monday, which is the 13th. So from the 13th through the 18th, things start to get a little hot and heavy. Especially like the 13th in the morning, we may see something less than to be desired, but it's probably weather, and that could be a tornado. We're looking maybe south, or we could hear about a hurricane forming a little early. It could be just a tropical depression out in the Atlantic. They're watching. We might hear about that. On the 14th, we're getting some economic news, and I'll read through what I expect to see in the headlines. But the tension starts to build, and we start to really notice tension building. These would be in conflict zones around the world. And then May 15th, things start to get very, very hot and interesting. And we could see something happen between Russia and Poland. We could see very interesting events coming out of Germany. This would be more like civil unrest. We could see multiple world leaders under strain, threat, assassination attempts, and leaders could also be CEOs, but I think these are most likely like presidents, premiers, chancellors, and this could be across the board. By the way, Germany's chancellor is in trouble. There's a lot going on, folks. May 17th is very volatile, as is the 18th. So that whole week. And if you're in New York, I would be very careful on public transportation that day, especially subways and anywhere around Wall Street. There's stuff. And if you're protesting, do be careful, because I think there's going to be violence towards protesters. So let's take a look and see at what I wrote for what's in the headlines, because I write this, obviously before it comes out in the month. So let's see. Let me get to the right page. Oh, I tell you, I've been so tired. I talked about that in the Patron only podcast as well. I was so tired. So before I get to what's in the headlines, pardon me for being incoherent, I'm going to read a little bit to you about from what I wrote for thoughts of the month. So energy of the month is page 5 on the Awake Space Astrology magazine. I'm looking at page 6 where I write my thoughts, and my I kind of pick up phrase for every month when I'm thinking of it. And these are my thoughts: eccentric, expansion, and a lot of luck. Okay. That's what I think for May. Because I think we dodge some very big potential worst case scenarios. So here's how it started. And again, I'll be doing patron only recordings. This is just a cold reading. So thoughts. I honestly hate it when people ask me that one word question with no context. I have loads of thoughts. Every single moment of the day, I have a billion thoughts going through my head. Not all of them are brilliant. Sometimes I'm wondering about how someone came up with making jelly, or how the first metalsmith figured out how to shape gold. Other times I'm thinking about how I managed to get yet another bruise on my leg without noticing what I banged into. Then my brain might ponder the astrology of the moment, and I might have an insight on the weather, or an earthquake, or I might have an idea and start comparing astrology charts from the 1800s with the 1900s to today. Thoughts are easy to come and go. Their usefulness can be up for debate. Welcome to May. It's going to be fascinating to watch our brains buzz and our attention be divided. Think of May as a time of eccentric, heightened weirdness. Oh, sure, more people will be awakened. And just like I say every time I'm asked about awakenings, it depends on what you do once your eyes are opened. Knowledge isn't power unless you know what to do with it. And we're really going to see that wisdom play out in real time once Jupiter bounces into Gemini. Being smart only gets you so far in life. We start the month off with Venus in a square with Pluto, making everyone even more aware with the cost of things. Not just the financial cost, but the social cost. As Mars in Aries makes its sextile to Pluto, we're going to see what people are really made of, and it's going to wake up even more people attached to the status quo. But will it bring more change? Maybe. Even if certain world leaders seem to get some karma served up nice and hot, will it really change what's going on in the world? Will it lead to major policy changes? Probably not in the short term. People raised on primetime television often have an unrealistic assessment of how long change actually takes to make. Nothing that happens right now is going to be the final form of any lasting change. We're still in a time of deconstruction, and it's going to last a while. And it's probably going to get really weird by the end of the month. We're all going to be more than a little overstimulated. With Mars flying through Aries throughout May and into June, we're looking at things getting hot under the collar. We definitely will see war drums banging and use of force against anyone questioning the status quo. There could be some big wins for those who are strategic and use logic over reactivity. But things will continue to be intense. This energy of May and June is setting up some of the big booms in July and August, which fuel the big bada booms of October. So my thoughts. We'll all have a lot of thoughts, and it's really important to know which thoughts are the ones you want to cultivate. Anything that causes you to dwell on the past or focus on problems is going to get you stuck in the mud. Knowing what started the problem doesn't repair the damage. We all need to focus on things that move us forward as individuals, as well as a collective. So if you want to read more of thoughts like that, you can check out the Awake Space Astrology magazine. Patrons at the $15 level and up get the magazine as a perk. Otherwise, you can find it for $19.99 in the Patreon store. If you don't want to pay Apple its fees, then use a different device. Don't use anything with an iOS or an Apple store to buy it. So what else is in the magazine this month? Well, we've got an article in astrology school on sextiles explaining that aspect. It's an energizing force, but there's that. We have astrology vocabulary for May. Every single month I do an astrology vocabulary lesson. Let's see. Got a great article on Pluto retrograde and how to use the energy of Pluto retrograde. A mundane overview of Jupiter in Gemini and a personal one. So kind of talking about the personal side of it. If you want to know more about Jupiter in Gemini, you can check out the Jupiter in Gemini video in Patreon. I did that as a drop for all paid members. And then, of course, I did a little reminder that we have the Guide to Instinct and Intuition in Astrology. Gave a little blurb on that. That is a patron perk. You can check that out for free in the store. I'm just trying to get to what we're going to see in the headlines. Let's see. And then I started a new series. I read this on one of my live streams and so you can listen to this if you head over to Patreon. It's a patron post for free as well as paid patrons. And I have a new series called The Work, Understanding Life as a Spiritual Being in a Physical Body, and talking about some understandings about being spiritual beings in physical bodies and spiritualizing matter. That's right. I think is very timely. You can still book and register in for intermediate astrology. We started, but it's a 14-week class, so you can commit to watching the first video and joining us. I also have the Interpreting Astrology series, and this week I talked about Beyond Duality and understanding the framework of consciousness and the spectrum it expresses in. I finally made it to what's in the headlines. All right, let's get to those dates. So May 10th through the 13th, we've got the moon in Cancer. Here's what I think is going to be in the headlines. We could see high-profile domestic violence or extreme violence committed by a woman, either way, or both. Fascists under pressure globally. Massive rain or snowfall could be a blizzard or a thaw causing flooding or ice melt. Dam breaches. By the way, I just found out from Matilda, there was a dam that fell apart in Australia. So dam breaches, rivers overflow banks, tidal activity is unusual. Money market volatile. Major infrastructure destroyed or a big failure of a dam, bridges, shopping center. So again, that dam in Australia. Restaurants close, issues with food supply and food processing plants. That could include food recalls. Government insider whistle blows or leaks to press, so we could see some press leaks on Monday. Nationalists under pressure in all nations, dairy or dairy farmers or dairy products recalled. Those could all be in the headlines. Major flooding, erosion events, issues with schools and or nurseries, family or child welfare in the news. And this could be like social programs, etc., schools, educational policies. Actually, there was a senator from Alabama who wants to create a pregnancy registry. Lord have mercy. But that would fit in these headlines. Issues with national security, espionage, leaks of information, or issues with homeland security in quotation mark. Donald Trump might get some restrictions in some way. Politicians investigated, indicted, or censured. National Guard or equivalent put into action. Could be Army Corps of Engineers or the equivalent. Water quality issues, environmental issues, and climate change. Coups, leaders deposed, or leader falls ill. Those are all potentials. May 13th through the 15th, we could see a really big storm with wind, hail, tornadoes, lightning strikes, power outages, transformers blow, grid failures. And remember, nowhere is a singular grid. You'd have to be like the size of Liechtenstein to have a singular grid. And even then, they probably have it split up a little bit. We could see a celebrity legal case or a person of note having a scandal. We might see King Charles in the headlines. Data breach and or payment gateway disruptions, credit card payment systems and ATMs. Historical event could be massive violence or explosion or a terrorist attack, especially on the 13th. High-profile person dies in accident or suddenly. That could be a politician, celebrity, influencer, CEO, somebody of note. Big transportation issues or accident involving trucking or rail. Supply chain breaks in multiple industries. That could be everything from manufacturing to raw materials to packaged goods. Big explosion. We could see at least one big explosion. Stock market, cryptocurrency, gold volatile, political figure or CEO ousted or killed or health crisis. Big temperature changes causing power outages or communications issues, internet disruptions, issues with satellites, cables, and communications, typhoons, cyclones, winds, fires of all kinds, big tornadoes or big windstorms possible. U.S.-Israel expands war. Big fire could be a warehouse, military base, something really, really big. It's a significant event. May 15th through the 18th, the moon is in Virgo, and we could see erosion events, landslides, rocksides, sinkholes, significant damage to roads / neighborhoods, expansion of viruses and or disease, big policy debates over fiscal matters, that's money policy, commercial real estate failures and defaults, global issues with rules, laws, and procedures, accounting software glitches or systems failures, biochemical weapons used and or discovered, missile launch goes wrong, farmers and livestock in the news, failed harvest, planting season delayed, discussion of crop yield or issues with farmers, potential legal action towards public figures and bureaucrats, accidents, leaks to do with oil, gas, or petrochemicals of any kind, or chemicals of any kind. Missiles, drones, rocket launches, telecommunications issues, cell towers, satellites, or internet cables sabotaged or broken by weathers and storms. Seismic activity greatly increased in Alaska, Japan, Chile, Mexico, Haiti, Central America, offshore of Northern California, Oregon. We could see a big sizable earthquake up to a 7.0 offshore. And that could happen also a couple days before this, but there's the potential that we could see a sizable earthquake offshore and not just in the Pacific Northwest. So don't freak out. But it could be, mid-Atlantic trench. We could be in the, somewhere near Indonesia, around the Philippines. It could also be political. It isn't necessarily like earthquakes and politics sometimes look alike. We could also see a public figure in a scandal or accused of inappropriate behavior, probably sexual inappropriate behavior, massive flooding event, big tides, waves, and or water damage, potential tsunami, chemical weapons, or chemical spills. So, shall we all just take another sip of coffee? Okay. Do me a favor. I really don't want to hear people are scared or worried. It's not that I don't care. It's actually because I really do care, and I am trying to prepare people. If you're scared or nervous or worried, it's natural. It's normal. We're all going to be on edge right now, but it doesn't help to kind of lean into that right now. We want to just kind of be like, okay, well, what do I have together? Do I need to get my documents in an easy to grab folder? Do I need to have, do I have enough water? Do I have enough dried goods? Do I need to get more ramen? Do I have a crank radio? These are things we can do. I've talked about preparing. We have Pluto retrograde. That's in our favor. Whenever the outer planets are retrograde, that's a good thing. That helps us prepare. And I want you guys to know, as crazy as this week is going to look, and again, I think there could be something in Germany. I think there could be something between Poland and Russia. Matilda and I spoke about that at length in the second event, even more so than the first event, because again, we mostly had people in from Europe and Asia in that audience. But it does look like I think we could see a significant bomb of some kind go where we don't want it to go. And I think everybody in the world is just going to go, no. It will not result in global thermonuclear war. It's not going to result in World War III. And everybody's going to be talking about it being like World War III. It's going to look like it, but it isn't going to be it. But there's something significant happening, and it's going to be significant. Okay. So just be really ready for that. It's also a bit of a surprise. As much as we did talk about Poland, there was a big fire in Warsaw, and that's just now. I'm recording this Saturday night, early hours of Sunday morning, so just to make sure I get this out on Monday. And I just found out about the fire in Warsaw, and I thought that was very interesting because I think we're going to find out it wasn't just a fire. It may have been some kind of sabotage action or politically motivated arson or something like that. So there's that, my friends. There's that. Super fun. Yeah. So I'm not fond of current world events either. And I think we could have avoided all of this mess. It might make a few people rich, but it doesn't make very many people rich. It certainly doesn't benefit the planet as a whole. And I think, as science goes along, we're going to find out we're a whole lot more interconnected, as a species with the planet than we give ourselves credit for with our ideas of dominionism. But I think it's really, really important to bear in mind that the more we worry, the more we try to burn it all down, the more we push against things, the less we're in solution mode thinking. We're just in the problem thinking. And I'm not saying don't protest. I think that's an important part of social action, but I just think there's other things we can do as well. And I've had people on talking about what they can do running for office, like how you can support candidates, especially at a grassroots level. Oh, yeah. Ted Cruz. So I think I'm going to do a part 2 of this episode. I think I'm going to do one where I'm going to read from the magazine, but I'm also going to roast Ted Cruz's chart. And then I'm going to take a look. I'm going to take a look at Panama's too. There's a bunch of stuff happening in Panama. And then I had a request to look at Guatemala's. So I'm going to look at those charts in there as well. So I think part 2 of this episode going up on Patreon, I think for $5 and up. And in fact, if you're in a grandfathered $3 tier, you don't have to go to $5. You're grandfathered in. It's just what was the $3 tier has been the $5 tier for like over a year now. So I say $5 and up because the $3 tier is unpublished. And if you're in that, you're grandfathered. Same with the old $11 tier. It's the same as the $15 tier. It's grandfathered. So yeah. So I think I'll do a part 2 on that. So that juicy stuff will be linked up. I'm gonna really enjoy looking at Ted Cruz's chart. Why am I doing it? Well, I heard he's under pressure. So that's fascinating. Still think the biggest threat at the moment is climate change. I know the rest of the world will look scary, but climate change is the most pressing matter. So before I talk about anything else, I mean, I'll take a peek at Ted Cruz's chart, but I'm not going to go through it thoroughly, but I'll go through what I'm going to talk about. After we do some patron shout outs, because I absolutely adore my patrons, because without patrons, this podcast doesn't happen. I feel a little bit like NPR. And so I'm going to give a shout out to our newest patrons. Remember, you can join Patreon for free. It doesn't get you a shout out, but it does get you a way to hang out with me and stay in contact, so that if TikTok goes away, or it's just hard to find me on your FYP because I don't do FYP worthy videos, I guess. But if I lied to you and told you your ex was coming back, I'd be all over your FYP. But yeah, so I'm going to be giving the Patreon a lot more love. I am putting out my patron discounts as well this week, so stay tuned. Alrighty, it's time for some patron shoutouts. All right, you heard the music. You know what time it is. It's time for patron shoutouts. Hey, if you're new listening to the podcast, I just want you to know that patrons make this podcast possible. What's a patron? They are members who pledge every single month to keep this podcast going. They help make it possible for me to take the time to share what I know, to share astrological information and insights with you, and to take the time to record, do the sound editing, and all the other fun stuff that happens when you're doing a podcast. So thank you to patrons. I always give our newest patrons a shout out every single week, and these are paid patrons at the $5 level and above. So we've got Stephanie, Kelly, Sue, Jess, Sylvia, Layla, Francesca, Mary, Ken Finn, Laura, Becca Lynn, Laura Master 3000, Jesse Peterson, Banana, Aaron Olds, Allison, Jaspreet, Cameron, Amy, Jen, Blanca, Mia, Carla, Charles, Wendy, Monica, NC, Lourdes, Yogi, aka Commander Neptar. I love that so much. Adrian, Nicole, Carmen, Gabriel, Melissa, Mina, Bobby Joe. Welcome, newest patrons. So what is coming up next? What are we going to talk about next, patrons? Couple of things upcoming. We've got Planet of the Month, which is no longer available to join as a member. But Planet of the Month is meeting on May 25th. We're going to get the Astrology Club up and going. And this will be more for people who are beginning and intermediate level. and to come in and chat and talk astrology. It'll be a facilitated discussion. And then, let's see, and that'll be taking over the Planet of the Month Club tier. And so, Planet of the Month Club will get Astrology Club plus their bennies. And let's see, I'll have some stuff up for Mystery School. I promise. Some good stuff for the Mystery School. And I think I'll just surprise you all. I'm working on a drop. Okay, I'm working on a drop. Trying to decide what I'm going to do with that. But I am going to do an astro alert. I haven't been doing as many astro alerts this year as I did like in the previous years, where I, every couple of days I was giving you an update. Probably do one for this week, because this week is a doozy, as I was talking about earlier in the podcast. Yeah. And if you've been feeling anxious, if you've been feeling kind of out of sorts, that's why. So patrons, paid patrons, you'll be getting your astro alert. And then we're going to do the podcast Q&A with, I'm also going to be talking about Ted Cruz on the patron only podcast. So just trying to stay up to date with what I'm doing. I know I talked about it earlier, but I recorded that last night. We're on Sunday recording now. Instead of making myself exhausted, I've been, managing my time a little better. Oh, checker for a fever. Speaking of fever, boy, I was so wiped out. I'm still kind of catching up. That travel was really getting me. So there's all of that. I've been looking through the Patreon Discord, and I think people are really feeling the tensions in the world. And I know it's frustrating with all of the brouhaha going around the world, politicians making some of the dumbest decisions we could make, watching abject cruelty go around, seeing people who have no regard for human life or humanity, and it can feel a little helpless. And I'm going to say that's exactly what it's kind of designed to do. And for anybody who's gone through any kind of abuse, where someone really tried to make you feel small and powerless, this can be very triggering. And that's why I always say, pull your energy in. Do what you can do about things you can do something about. I'm not telling you to be a sociopath and don't care about what's going on in the world. But I'm also going to say putting your focus on things where you are powerless does not help you at all. So in the patron only podcast, I'm going to talk about some of the metaphysics that we can employ. And in the mystery school, I'm going to do you a very special podcast about how to wield your own energy and put protective energy around the innocent. So that's coming up this week. So that's what we've got for patron shoutouts, my friends. All right. I think we're going to go talk a little bit about how we're going to get through this week. All right. What we can do this week. So the moon pops into Leo right around the time this podcast is airing on Monday. And it is in an approaching opposition with Pluto, which is retrograde. So it's probably not going to be a massive boom, but it's a boom. And as we move through Monday into Tuesday, especially like Monday night, it gets pretty wild because the moon will be trine Mars. And there's a lot of people out there, trines are good, squares are bad. I'm not so fond of the good bad interpretation. I want you to understand with a trine, it's unrestricted energy. And when I look at it from a mundane perspective, where we're really not looking at anybody having any kind of agency, that is the moon in Leo, which is very big feelings, unrestrictedly Mars in Aries, which is very personalized action. So I will say it'll probably be pretty aggressive out in the world, especially in the Eastern Hemisphere. We could see border conflicts escalate. We could see things going on with Israel, Palestine getting even more intense, or hearing about issues with fire bombs, all sorts of fun stuff. And that was sarcasm and a little defeatism. I wish I could give you guys good news when it comes to things going on in the world, where it's Philippines and China, that's starting to get hot. China and Taiwan, that's very tense. North to South Korea, as well as other border conflicts. I do think we'll probably see something in Eastern Europe this week. I think that's going to happen after the 15th. We're going to see events heat up starting Monday night, most likely. As far as on the day-to-day, what do you do? It's really easy to want to pour your heart out. It's really easy to make, or not easy, but it's really tempting to make emotional pleas. I think, helping individuals as much as possible out in the world, helping families get to where they need to go. And that could happen, for any person needing refugee status. Nobody leaves home because, they just feel like running on a jaunt. People don't run for their lives on a whim. So there's that. I know it's hard to look out in the world and wonder, where is the humanitarianism? But I'm seeing it all over the place. I'm seeing more and more people care about other people that they have nothing in common with. I'm seeing people care about situations they've been ignorant about most of their lives. And I know it's frustrating for you now. I know it's hard for you now. It's been ongoing for a very, very long time. There's been brutality happening for a very, very long time. I know it's hard to wake up. It can be a very painful thing to be awake, especially when you're surrounded by people who do not have their eyes open to the reality in the world. It's not your job to wake them up. It's not your job to wake them up. Your job is now to focus on you and what you can do with what you've got, and to understand that since you are awake, that it isn't not allowing yourself to be disempowered or to oppress yourself further. That's really, really important. One of our patrons, Kendall, she goes live on TikTok, and she has just moments of humanity just to check in with each other. Just be like, hey, how you doing? Are you all right? Are you not all right? How can we support each other? Sometimes just being witnessed can help. It is hard to look in the wider world and injustice go unattended, unremarked, or ignored, or glossed over. And the institution of gaslighting can be crazy making. And one of the things I've learned over a lifetime of paying attention is you can't change the whole world as one person. That was a really painful lesson for me to learn as a young woman. It was extremely painful because I'm a can-do kind of gal. And as I went along through life, I was in my early 30s when I met Stephen Glenn, PhD, who is the founding researcher of resiliency studies. He started in the late 60s, early 70s. He was one of the kindest, most empathetic human beings that I know, that I've ever met. He passed away in the mid-2000s, and I was devastated when he died because he was truly one of the most compassionate human beings I ever met. And he knew I was a crusader rabbit, that I wanted to make the world a better place. And I was pretty jaded at that point. I'd really realized there wasn't a whole lot I could do. And I trained under him with his program, Developing Capable People. And it was a program to develop resiliency in adults and children. It was kind of labeled a parenting course so that the Family Resource Center I taught it through could get grants for the class, and support it. But it was, and so we kind of focused on parenting, but it was really about developing resiliency in people. It was a communications course above all else. And the main thing was remembering we're all people. We're all people with individual perceptions. And I was getting, after my training, I was getting a lot of, these were 10-week courses, and I was getting all of the court-ordered parents. And I was like, why am I the one getting all the court-ordered parents? Because a lot of times people take it voluntarily. Nothing wrong with court-ordered parent. I just want you to know there's lots of reasons people get ordered to take a parenting class. It's not always because they're abusive. It could be because of divorce, lots of reasons. But they don't want to be there. Like, nobody wants to be forced to do something. And so it was always a little bit of a hostile environment the first couple of weeks of class. And my little Libra moon was like, what do we do with this? And I had a few tough sessions. And in fact, at a certain point, I thought, do they hate me? Is this why I'm getting all these people who don't want to be here? And some of them were there because they were less than effective parents and did not see their children as individual human beings because they hadn't been seen as individual human beings growing up. When we've been objectified, it's very hard to not objectify others. But one of the things that was disturbing me was, without fail, at the end of the 10 weeks, all of the people there would be like, when I asked what the big aha was in the class, they'd be like, that my kid is a person. And that really bothered me. I was like, how can that be the big aha? And so when it came time to go back into training, because once we'd been through the training, we could go back as much as we wanted, and it was once a year, and so I went back and I brought this up, and I was like, what do I do with this? What do I do with that? That's the big aha. It was really bothering me. I was 31, 32 years old, and I was just like, what do you mean? And he was like, isn't it wonderful that they now recognize their children are human or people? Isn't it wonderful they recognize that now? You just took them 100% ahead. And I was like, I didn't think of it that way because I was coming from judgment and he was coming from progress. I was like, that was a really valuable lesson. And he said, hey, I know you want to make all the big changes in the world and you want to make sure everybody's safe. And you want to, do that. But how is that helping you? How is it serving you to live in that level of frustration? Like, what's your blood pressure? And I'd be like, sometimes it gets a little high. And he said, it's not your job to judge people's progress. It's your job to celebrate any at all. And if they came in at minus 50 and they leave at minus 10, there's progress. If they came at minus and they leave at plus 5, that's great. You're making a difference, one person at a time. And then he said, tell me, instead of thinking about all the people that kind of concerned you in your classes, was there anybody who stood out? And I said, yeah, there was this grandma who's like so supportive of her grandkids and her daughter. And she was just there to make it better, like to get better communication skills. And she was so invested. She was, sharing what she learned with her daughter who couldn't come because of work, and was sharing stories about how things were improving in their household. And he goes, that's great. You made a big difference. You helped facilitate somebody who was ready to learn. Focus is there. And then he goes, how's this been helping you? And I was like, well, it's made me a lot more mindful of what I do at home. It's made me a lot more mindful of how I treat my children and speak to my children, which is why I teach this. I want to be a better parent always. And he said, then you're changing the world one person at a time. And it starts with you. And it was humbling. I've been so blessed with such good teachers in my life. So I know it's hard when we look at everything out in the world that seems just so big. And it's easy to go, my God, you're just realizing this is bad now. But look at any and all progress. So to me, when I see the amount of people saying that we don't have to believe the same way, we don't have to agree on everything to say it's not okay to treat people less than human. and we start looking at everything else in the world and say, we're going to share our humanity today. And I'm seeing a lot of shared humanity. I really am. I think that's a positive thing. And I think that's going to help us get us through the next bumpy ride, which is for the foreseeable future, where there's no easy resolution right now, guys. There's just not. There's no easy resolution. I wish there was. I just wish there was. But there's not. Oh, what can you do this week? Well, celebrate anything that's in a more positive light. And I'm not talking about bypassing. Celebrate saying Bizan. Celebrate people helping people. Celebrate uplift people where you can. Have a good laugh at the blockout movement. That one's pretty funny. I think blocking people has some effectiveness. I think there is an economic impact to it, especially if people are shilling products. I'm not a big celebrity person, so that's why I don't do a lot of celebrity charts. I've never been into pop culture. I don't look down on pop culture. It's just not something I'm all that interested in. Never really have been. Blame me being neurospicy. I don't know. I've just never really gotten into it because I kind of see everybody as equal. I don't understand why some people get more attention than others. Not, again, maybe it's the tism. I don't know. Probably is. I'm like, I don't know. We all poop. I think stepping back, it's why one of the reasons when I was talking about Macklemore's chart on my TikTok, that I was reminding people he's a human being with flaws. I'm not saying he's perfect. I was describing his chart and what about him makes him an activist and always has. One of the problems is when we look at activists, we try to turn them into saints, right? And most saints weren't the saints you think they are, right? It's just they had a bard in the Middle Ages crafting a tale, right, about them. But, they were human. They had desires, they had flaws. There's no way George Washington never told a lie. That's all propaganda because we want to deify people and give our power away. And so it's very interesting with Pluto retrograde in Aquarius having that top note of Leo there, just this whiff of Leo. And it's undoing of deification of human beings. And I'll argue most deities are basic projections of human thought. Period. Doesn't mean that energy doesn't exist because thoughts are energy and enough focused thought can create a whole lot. Really, is it a deity if it's so petty? That seems like a very human quality to me. She's rambling. But that's what we're looking at this week. So I want you to kind of go within and not having to measure progress by grand gestures or big events. If you can donate $5 to a family trying to get safe, cool. If you can't afford that, that's okay. You got to pay your rent. If you can support other people sharing that message, if you can just block people, that's one of the reasons, celebrity is kind of being undone. It's about time. It was just, it's just a way to distract, in my opinion. Just my opinion. And, we all like a little bit of gossip. We're all human. We like, we like celebrity tea. There's always a little bit of gossip going on, and that's okay. It's okay. So there's that. Yeah. Other things you can do this week. Stop being shocked. Like, oh, I can't believe it. Yeah, it's there. So basically, all bad things have always existed. All good things have always existed. They've coexisted since time immemorial. I remember like 15 years ago online, somebody was like, child abuse is so bad now. It never used to be that bad. And I was like, it's always existed. It's always existed. In fact, children weren't even considered actually human. And children like that, they didn't get a childhood. Look at Victorian era times. Look at the early 1900s. Look at what was going on in the garment district in New York. Look at what's going on in any garment district now, et cetera, et cetera. Chimney sweeps. They had to be little. They were children. None of this is new. None of the animosity is new. Genocide isn't new. And it happens. And it is brutal. And what hasn't happened in my memory, in my lifetime before, is so many people. It's unacceptable. There were always people who protested, but not on this scale. And that's been something very interesting to watch. So I celebrate that. So celebrate every little win, because that's the hope that keeps you going. Share that. And I'm not saying don't vent in the venting chamber in our Discord. Absolutely. Go ahead, because sometimes we do need to give a good old rip. And that's what the venting chamber is for. It was to keep the venting off the rest of the server. Just because, sometimes people get in venting. It's just sometimes it's crazy energy and we need to vent. That's why I made the chamber, because it holds that energy. Just like we have a celebration room and we put all our celebrations in there, and then we know where to look, and then we can keep things on topic elsewhere. But yeah, feel free to dive into the venting chamber, patrons, because that's a good place for it. I'd like to keep it there because some people are fragile. Some people, they're trying not to vent, because if they vent, they'll tip over. They won't be able to get out of bed. So having a place that's where it's contained, because you have to remember, everybody has their own sensitivities. And so it's having a safe space to vent makes it safe for everybody, including people who are just like, I can't do it right now. I can't be that kind of emotional support. I think that's important. Okay. So if you're a patron and you haven't joined the Discord, you can find that in the Patreon chat. I put the link up. I'll put it up again this week so that you can dive in. There's all kinds of information. It's also where we keep track of my predictions in the news headlines thread, and then the current events chat is where we talk about what's going on, and occasionally use middle finger emojis towards politicians. I know I just mentioned Macklemore. I'll do his chart on the Patron Only podcast this week as well. Give a little more depth to what I talked about on my TikTok. If you haven't seen my TikTok, make sure you go to my TikTok account. I'll link that up in the show notes. One thing that would really help me, if you're not seeing me on your FYP, if you guys would leave comments of 5 words or more. Okay. That helps generate. I try to respond to as many comments as possible, because the more engagement, the more I'll hit the FYP. All right. So that helps. I'll make more content. I've been trying to rearrange my schedule. I have the energy to do that. So I'll make more videos. I just haven't felt like it. I've been like, I don't want to do predictions. It's a shit show. I don't know how many more times and how many different ways I could say it's a shit show. And then people come back with, I'm scared. And I'm like, I don't know what to do with that. I can't make everybody, I don't want to scare people, but I'm not a fan of ignorance. I'd like to know when stuff is coming. So speaking of, we could see some interesting weather brewing this week as well. Let me take a look at the charts. We could. Interesting weather. Let's see. Yeah. Like I said, the big day, the 15th is kind of dicey. the 15th is a little dicey because that's when the moon is going to, it's actually the fate on the 14th into the 15th, early hours of the morning. So again, I'm looking at Eastern Europe and the Levant, North Africa, Mediterranean. Yeah, so Eastern Hemisphere. It could even be things with Asia as well. Like not Asia Minor, but Asia Major. Or the Indian subcontinent either. We could see some border skirmishes between India and China, India and Pakistan as well. Not all of that makes American news. I have to go really search for it. But we'll have the moon squaring off with Uranus, actually Venus, Uranus, the sun, and Jupiter from late on the 14th West Coast time into the early hours of the 15th. This could also be seismic or activity. And then we've got Mercury at the 29th degree of Aries. When does that switch over? I could look at my handy dandy cheat sheet, but no, I'm going to keep drawing up astrology charts because, I'm not going to go like get the exact time. I won't doodle around that way. But yeah, so on the 15th, we have Mercury moving into Taurus. Mercury moves into Taurus, and it's square Pluto. I think between the 15th and the 18th, we're going to see some phenomenal accidents. I think it's going to deal with trains. I think it could deal with public transportation. Cargo, the planes delivering large loads that could be like, military cargo planes, aid planes. I don't think it's like a passenger plane, like a commercial, unless it's something like DHL. Again, parcels, shipping, that kind of thing may have problems. We could also see like the transport of animals, so livestock, so horses, cattle, llamas, chickens. Chickens aren't really under Taurus, but like if it's a lot of them, like if they're moving a poultry farm type thing, we could see that. So to be aware, you know, there's all of that. So just kind of be ready for that and then be a helper. Don't just look for the helper, be a helper. It doesn't mean you have to be a hero. But, if we can just be a little kinder to people, a little gentler with people, if we can kind of take a breath, slow it down, check and see if somebody's okay. Before calling somebody to vent, just be like, how's your day going? Check in, make sure their mental health is okay before you unload. I think a lot of times we don't think about that. All right. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about astrology while we end this up. I'll answer a couple questions, but I'm going to save most of the questions for the Patron only podcast. So I think sometimes people get confused about what astrology is in astrology charts. I got asked a question, or somebody actually made a statement on one of my TikToks, and they were like, hey, I really feel like this energy is Juneteenth of 1865, but I don't know how to research it. And to be honest, it doesn't. Not really. When I look at the astrology. But I kind of think, I didn't have a conversation with them, so I'm not sure what they're trying to equate. But the way you research a historical event is you draw up an astrology chart, with the date, time, and place, and you compare the astrology. But you have to know the astrological rulerships. You have to know, what planets rule, what's the opposing. So when I say we're in the flip side of 1941, I'm talking about Pluto. And one of the reasons I'm talking about it being the flip side is Uranus was in Taurus at very similar degrees. We had Jupiter and Uranus in Taurus, actually. And in May of 91, and Pluto was in Leo at that time. It is in the opposite position in Aquarius right now, meaning we're on the flip side, which is an old term we used to use for vinyl records. You had the A side, you had the B side, So the B side was the flip side. There we go. That'd be like a good rhyme, wouldn't it? And so if you want to look up historical events, you can. You can draw the charts up. That's easy to do. You could look at AstroSeek, put in dates. You use a noon time if you don't know the time of the event. An astrology chart is just a frame of reference for a moment in time and space, period. We don't know. Like if you just handed me a chart with no reference, I wouldn't know if it was a person or an object or a place or an event. And depending on that knowledge, I would need that knowledge in order to interpret it properly. Yeah. So we have to have a frame of reference to key it in. And so that's an important thing to remember. So there's that. Yeah. So I'm going to answer a couple questions here, and then we'll close out the podcast for the week so I can get the patron-only stuff out. So I got a couple I have to make because people have been telling me they want more exclusive stuff, and so I'm going to do some exclusive stuff for different tiers. And I'll be creating and crafting a schedule, all that kind of fun stuff. So I'm going to answer questions next. And I'm going to let you know that I opened up natal readings for me. Okay, you can still read with the amazing astrologers, Casey, Jennifer, and Mackenzie. And I'm going to open up natal readings just for a month. I'm probably going to close them after because I do prefer doing consultations because it's super fun. But I know there's a lot of people who want me to read their natal charts. So I'm going to open it up briefly. And if you're a patron, you'll get a very special discount. All right, let's answer some patron submitted questions. If you want to submit to be answered on this podcast or in the patron only Q&A, just click the link to the Googly form. I'll put it again in the chat on Patreon and in the patron only podcast link. So Ms. G is asking, when your sun is so close to your rising or your sun is your rising, is that like a giant exclamation point or is that just geography? Ooh, good question. So first of all, your sun, if it's on the rising sign or the ascendant, it isn't your rising. It is conjunct your rising sign. And it is like a giant exclamation point. It does point to the geography. It means you were born as the sun was rising, but it kind of gives you a double whammy. I like to kind of call that a Popeye statement. I am who I am. So that's a very strong identity. I am who I am. I love that. You can't be anything other than who you are with that. Nobody can make you conform. Shelby is asking, what are some ways you can make the most out of square energy for transit planets squaring off with your major natal placements and creating tension? So the way I like to describe dealing with squares, and that's a great question, Shelby. The way I like to describe the way to deal with squares is to understand that, let's say, squares are always about making the decision. Okay. It's always like decision time. You have option A, option B, and they're at loggerheads. And so at that point where the square meets, where it becomes the square at the 90-degree angle, is option C. It's not exactly middle ground. It's like frustration builds to the boiling point, and there's an alchemical moment, and to be creative. So as long as you're like trying to straddle either or, and neither are working, it's kind of like, it's just a really good example. It's like maybe you're under economic duress, right? The economy sucks. You've done all the austerity measures you can. You're looking at your budget of what you can take out. You're very stressed. The bills are due. And so, you've got A, you're looking at austerity, and B, bills are due. And that stress is building. And then you have an epiphany of like, well, I can't cut anything else. All I can do is find something else. And so you're like, well, what can I do? Well, I got OfferUp on my phone. What could I sell? And you start looking for ways to bring income in. Okay. That's something you could do with that square energy. A lot of times it's that crisis point that forces us to make a decision that takes us in a direction we need to go. So I would say squares are always growth oriented. They're uncomfortable, but growth isn't always easy, nor is it comfortable. So that was a really good question. So that's something you can do. You want to recognize it's creative. And as long as you're sitting in the stress of it and not seeking a solution, because you'd be like, well, as long as I'm thinking black and white, I can't find sepia or gray. Okay. So you've got to look for that other option. If you have questions around that, you can ask in the Discord. That was a good question, Shelby. Of Finland. Hi, Laurie. I often hear astrologers talk about transiting planets making aspects to the ascendant or the midheaven. When it comes to house cusps, I rarely hear someone say Pluto is squaring my second house cusp. Instead, I hear people just say which planets are transiting their houses. Would an aspect to a house cusp beside the conjunction be useful to consider? I'm guessing the reason why I don't hear people talk about these aspects is because most software doesn't print it out, which forces people to do the math. Yes, Steve, you're partially correct. And there is an overemphasis of the angular houses. And the angular houses are the ascendant, the IC, the descendant, and the MC. And so there's a lot of emphasis on that because those tend to be very personal, like identity-wise. But I do pay attention to what's happening in relationship to house cusp. So if you do have Pluto squaring off with the second house, to follow up on Shelby's question, is if it's making a very, tight square, I wouldn't use an 8-degree orb on a house cusp. I really would go with a 2 or a 3. That's my personal preference. You might choose to use a wider orb. That'd be fine. You guys know how I like tight orbs. But, and for those of you listening, what is an orb? An orb is the distance that makes what we call an aspect. So it's kind of the plus or minus wiggle room. So, if it's making a square, we know that's a 90-degree angle, but I would give 2 or 3 degrees on either side of that. Okay. So it does impact. You can see if you approach the houses as how you deal with that area of life, then obviously if there's some strain, then it forces decisions. But yeah, there's that. Great question as always, but people don't talk about it because it's not really often discussed that way, especially you have to remember, most of the literature is beginning, maybe to intermediate, like beginning intermediate level. And that's not really something we tackle at that stage in our astrological studies. That's something we tackle a little later on, if we have the interest to do so. And it's a little more on the mundane side of things. So there's that. I'll do one more question, because then I'm going to save some for the patron only. Oh, I love this. Scorpio Teacup. Looking for some advice here, as I've also heard you speak on this before and wonder if you could talk about it a little more. As somebody who's beginning to pursue something, being an artist, creator, etc., what is your best advice for dealing with the paralyzing feelings of comparison to people who are already successful and have what you want? In my experience, it's really hard to move through, and really would appreciate your opinion. I love this question. And by the way, you guys can ask me questions like this. It doesn't just have to be about us. I love that. So funny enough, I did used to compare myself to people who were far more experienced than me. So like when I was in my 20s and I was looking at the people who became my teachers, the Joanne Wickenbergs, the Jeffrey Wolf Greens, the hands, I was like, oh my God, I'm nowhere close to them. I don't even dare. Right. That's silly. And in fact, I remember once I was sitting with Joanne and she was reviewing my chart and she was like, write the fucking book. I was like, I don't feel qualified. She's like, you don't need any more qualifications. Write the fucking book. You're an amazing teacher. And she really did say, write the fucking book. And I didn't believe her. I thought she was being nice, because I just didn't feel qualified. I don't know what would have made me feel qualified at that stage. So I continued to study. And honestly, technology was in a totally different place than it is now. And I get what she was saying now. And that's exactly why I do what I do. So it stayed with me. What I can tell you is if you don't start, you're never going to be where they're at. They had to start somewhere. They didn't start out perfect. Some of them might have started out more privileged, but it's just a form of self-sabotage. So just make yourself do something. Stop looking at them. I don't honestly follow very many metaphysical creators. I keep my eyes in front of me and I talk about what I'm going to talk about. So if you're an artist or a creative, comparing yourself to somebody else is futile because art is very, very individual. It's like, why would you want to be like, one of the things that bugs me, like if I were to write a fiction book, if somebody told me like or somebody wrote a review and said, she's the next Tolkien, I'd be like, don't compare me to freaking anybody. I don't want to be compared to anybody in my creative pursuits, although if somebody said I was like rubber hand, I would probably poop myself and be like, oh my God. And I'm nothing close. But if that ever were to happen when I'm like 80 years old, I'll still poop myself. I don't think we'll ever have another rubber hand. But like if you got compared to somebody like that, then I'll be like, all right. If somebody said I'm the next Salvador Dali, I don't know, maybe. But it would never happen because I can't paint. Like I literally can't paint. I might be able to do like pointillism because Renoir couldn't see either. I knew that as a kid before they talked about it openly. I was like, that guy was blind like me. That's how I see. Everything's pixelated. I digress. But yeah, you have to get over yourself. You just have to do it. Now, what I did do after Joanne told me write the fucking book is I did write a little workbook and I printed it off. And I taught at metaphysical shops. I taught it at woo-woo shops. And I taught classes on the local area because I didn't even know how to get started teaching. So I started to build my chops as a teacher and learn how to teach astrology and what people's questions were. And, just learned how to teach. And I'm glad I did. I put a lot of time into that. I taught at metaphysical stores for quite a long time in the early 2000s into the mid 2000s. So I had to be careful in the area I lived in because it was pretty conservative. So I kind of go a little further afield. But I would teach spirit workshops at different conferences. I taught on resistance patterns. So not just astrology, I studied other stuff to make me a better astrologer. So whether it was metaphysical or coaching, client management techniques, just being able to be better at serving people in general as a service provider. I learned a lot about business. I would learn a lot of different things and understand what makes that person successful isn't just talent. They have a whole mechanism behind them. So I would gain a lot of different skills. That was a really, really good question. It was a really good question. So for more really, really good questions like that, come to the Patreon and you'll get to, I think you'll get to hear some great answers. In fact, I've got one I'm going to answer about what do I see happening with celebrity culture, which I talked a little bit here on the podcast, but I'll go into that a little bit more deep. I'm going to talk about some Jupiter returns on the Patron-only Q&A. Let's see. Talk about solar flares and kind of how we might see those in a chart. That was a really good one. Yeah, so I'll answer those. I'm going to do Ted Cruz and Macklemore's charts in the Patron-only podcast. And then I'm going to make a special recording. I don't know if it's going to happen this week, Christy, but I will start recording the articles for patrons because there's requests. People are enjoying the soothing, dulcet tones of yon podcast host. And I'd be glad to do that. I love to read. I'd love to be the story lady. So my Venus and Gemini just can't say no to a request like that. So patrons, remember, if you guys have requests and stuff, you can always put it in a comment, ask in the Discord. You can always tag me in the Discord, ask in the chat. I'm always willing to hear like what you guys want, because without you, there's no me, and I'll try to serve the best I can. If you want to join the Patreon to help support the podcast and all of the other stuff that we put out in the world, you can join by clicking the link in the show notes or going to patreon.com/the Awake Space. If you can't subscribe, but you still want to stay in touch and kind of be, able to be messaged by me, or if you can't find me on your FYP or whatever, also go click that link in the show notes and you can join the Patreon for free. I get it. The economy is crap. So if you can support us, great. If you can't, you just want to send vibes. Vibes are valuable too. I'm Laurie Rivers. I'm your host of the Awake Space Astrology Podcast. I want to thank you for listening, and I'll talk to you next week.